Hey guys, this is the first video in a series of Redshift easy how-to tutorials. I've been asked some questions and so I figured I would start a series, and this episode will be tackling particle rendering in Redshift and Maya, and also Maya fluid rendering and conversion from to OpenVDB to render out in Redshift. And currently, Redshift doesn't render Maya fluids natively, so you have to convert them into OpenVDB. Same thing goes with particles in the other apps. Recently, Redshift updated so that their Maya version actually just supports the particles automatically, so they get converted automatically behind the scenes into small spheres. And previously, you actually had to instance geometry, so you don't have to do that anymore. I'm sure the other apps will follow soon. And so here's just a basic sim, some particles just being emitted, and they have some age color change and opacity color change going on. And so if you look for it, you could adjust the particle size here in your particle sim, and Redshift automatically picks this up, so you don't have to worry about doing this outside of here. You can just do it in your nParticle sim. And your shape, your per particle attributes, you need to make, if you want opacity, you're gonna have to, create an opacity PP, an RGB PP, and this basically, once you create it by age or whatever attribute you want, you have a ramp that you can then edit to your liking. So if I wanted this to turn into another color towards the end, let's just, I don't know, go with like a really hot pink. Eventually, as I crush this, since this is a really early sim, these colors don't really get influenced on this end because it's by age. So I'd have to like really bring this in. And if see, so now it updated. So if let's move the gradient back a little bit, get more of the purple back in, move around. Okay, so we got a cool little transition going on. Move this. Okay, so a lot of people wonder, okay, how do I get this to render? Because if I fire off an IPR right now in Redshift, it's not, see, you're just gonna get black. It's not gonna do anything. It's not reading the material. So what you have to do is, first of all, make sure your particles are selected, and you're gonna assign a new material. We're gonna go with just the standard Uber shader Redshift has, so the Redshift material. We assign that, and now it's gray, the base color. One important thing to always remember with Redshift and particles, you want to add an object property for visibility when you're selecting your particle simulation. And the reason you want to add this is because, let's say you're refracting particles behind glass or something like that. If you don't have the visibility node turned on, the particles won't render. And so this is just a little quirky thing you gotta make sure. Right under the Redshift menu, object properties, and a visibility node for your current selection. And so once you add that, you're good to go. And so now people would say, okay, how do I get the color information out of my simulation and into my actual render? So I decided to pause the recording and cache out the entire simulation just so we have some cool run-up going on further along the line. And I edited the ramp to give some nice gradation going on. And now that this is cooler looking and it's further along and it's cached out, ready to go, we have to figure out, how do we get this color information from the RGB PP out and into Redshift's material in order to render this out. So right now, if I currently just hit render and I fire off an IPR, what we're going to get is this gray just material, just the basic Redshift material we assigned earlier. And right now, we are not getting the gradient information from RGBPP. And so currently in Redshift for Maya, there's two ways of doing this. There's the old way and the new way. They both work. They'll both get the job done. And so right now, we'll start off with the old way of doing it. So now that I got IPR rendering right now, one way you could do this is using the old particle sampler. So look for the particle sampler info node, and with this, you click on this white output and go to other, and you'll find underneath the other out color. And so it's right here. You click out color, pipe that into your diffuse, and as soon as the IPR updates right now, we should be getting the color gradient that so here we go. So we got the gradient coming out from the sim RGB info. And so there's the current render using particle sampler. And to get the opacity information out, use the same node, but you can't connect it from the same node. You actually have to make a separate new particle sampler. So you open up another particle sampler node, and Redshift has the alpha information reversed from the standard Maya. So in Redshift, white actually means solid and black means empty, while in Maya normally for scanline render and stuff that's reversed. So you actually have to make a reverse node to reverse this information. So you have now a reverse node, and you click this white button again right here on the particle sampler, and you're going to get out transparency. It's not our opacity PP. For some reason you got to use out transparency, and so then you're going to pipe this into the input. And now with this, you could just add the output to your opacity. And so your opacity on your Redshift material can be found underneath overall. And here you got the opacity slot, so you could just connect that in. And once the IPR refreshes, we'll be seeing the opacity fade, so it'll be solid towards the emission point, and then the gradient kind of goes out and it starts to fade out as it goes. And of course the opacity can be adjusted if you go back to your particle sim and you adjust the ramp underneath the attributes section. And so per particle array, if you go into opacity PP and then edit the ramp and adjust it however you want, same way you would adjust the color. And so yeah, that's how you get that out. And let's actually get rid of the background just so we could see this better. The HDR will still be lighting this, but it'll just be on a black background just for visual purposes. So we'll just go to the dome light and uncheck enable background. And so it's still being lit by the dome light, but it's just on a black background. And so if we check the alpha, we'll have a nice clean alpha matte too. So if we want to composite this later onto something. And okay, so now we got this going on. We got the gradient, we got the color information being fed into it, and it's coming along. And so this is one way of approaching this. So you use the particle sampler node, and the new way to do this is using the new Redshift user attributes nodes. And they're not only for this, they can do a ton of other stuff, but just for now I'll only be covering their uses with particles. And so let's just delete these out of the Redshift material. So let's just disconnect that, get rid of this, and so now we're actually going to have just the gray material. It's a little dark because when I unplugged the color info from the particle sampler, it actually made it black. So let's just make that a white again. And yeah, so here we got just the standard material now back on here. And so to get the exact same look going, you just use a user attribute. So type in user, and you'll get, and by the way, to get to these menus in here, it's just like Nuke. You just hit tab and start typing, and it'll figure out what you're looking for as you type it. And so what you're looking for is the Redshift user data color. And once you have one of these made, under the attribute, you just type in RGB PP, hit enter, and your output, you just plug that into your diffuse, and as this updates, we should be getting the same color just like we did with the particle sampler. And there's that. And again, to add the opacity, you got to make a new node. So let's get a second user data color. And again, we got to reverse this so that it flips the black and the white information. And so we'll get the out into the input, the output of this back into the opacity slot. And so just drop that in, or you could just chain it up like that into opacity color. And that's that. Oh, and actually, I forgot to mention what you have to type in here. You would think that since the color information gets RGB/pp, this actually has to get also just like the sampler info node. You got to get the transparency out. So you just type in transparency pp, hit enter, and let this update. And it should, yeah, so now we're getting the opacity information by age and also color by age. And so that's how you go about you getting color information and opacity information out and feeding it into your Redshift shader. And at the same time, the two ways to do it. The only thing you got to keep in mind is basically you got to reverse the opacity, and the color just feeds in fine. And just to remember to use RGB/pp and transparency pp for the opacity. Now that that's out, one thing to keep in mind with transparencies is due to the fact that there's limits to basically how many times a ray can go through an object. For a situation like this where you have basically tons of little spheres, and let's actually zoom in here so you can actually see the small spheres. And what happens is basically there's a certain point where Redshift will say, okay, it's time to cut off how many times we're gonna go through the objects. And so what's going on is basically under the Redshift render options right here under opt, you have the trace depth, and I think the defaults are 3 for reflection, 3 for refraction, and 6 combined. And so if you want more fidelity in the render where you're getting, to see behind deep layers of stacked, layered on top of each other particles, you want to increase the trace depths. But in doing this, you also increase render time. So this is something to keep in mind. If you don't really need it, let's say you're going to motion blur this and you're not even going to notice this, then that's fine. But if for some reason you do want extra and you don't mind the added render time, then go for it. So I'll actually do a little test render right here just so we can kind of see what's going on. And actually, let me turn on the background again, just so that way you have something behind to better see the translucent effect. So we'll enable the background and we'll fire off a little render of this section real quick. And okay, so as you can see, they're see-through, but they're not that there's the fidelity isn't all the way there, and that's just because the trace depths aren't set up high enough. And so you usually, for diffuse objects, this isn't really a problem, but if you're going to layer up glass and refractive objects, you usually want to increase this quite a bit. And so I'm actually going to let's see, change the reflection a little bit. Let's just get a little more reflection on the spheres. Drop the roughness so we can get a cool little bit of specular on these spheres. And we're going to increase this to, let's just go all the way, 16. And so this is going to increase the render time quite a bit, but it should end up looking better. So we're gonna do a little test render right now. Let's save this and re-render this. And so this last one only took 10 seconds. This is probably going to take a little longer. I'm also using brute force, which isn't the cleanest, but it's the fastest for preview purposes. For final render, I'd probably switch it to brute force irradiance cache, or even irradiance cache, irradiance point cloud, one or the other. But for right now, usually brute force is just cool. It's fast for iteration purposes. And so let's zoom in here. I'm actually, yeah, see, it's subtle, but basically you get more fidelity in certain spots because it shows the transparency of the layering effect. Basically, you lose this layering of objects the more times the ray has to go in and hit, refract more than X amount of times. So if you increase this, that adds on to that. For now, I mean, I don't really have to worry about it because I'm gonna add motion blur to this, and it's mostly gonna get lost. But so to get motion blur going into the particles, all you really have to do is just turn it on. There's nothing else to it. So underneath your output, in the Redshift settings, just hit, turn on motion blur. Transformation steps, this basically increases the quality of your motion blur, but I mean, this is just for preview purposes. We're not really going for final render right now, so 2's fine. The duration is basically how long the aperture is staying open, and so higher will give you more motion blur, lower less. And the shutter start and shutter end, this is just how long it's open between the beginning and the end, and where you want to center the shutter. And so let's just leave it at the standard stock with just motion blur on, and let's just try a full render of the entire shot and see how it turns out. And this is in bucket mode, so we're not doing progressive IPR. It's just we're going for an actual low quality render. And so let that load, and you could already see that there's a little bit of motion blur going on. Actually, I should turn off the dome light just so we can see just the particles alone. So let's turn that off and hit escape and re-render this. And so, but you could already tell there's motion blur all over the place. And so if I want to increase the strength, then open up the frame duration, space out the shutter start and shutter end. I think this is fine. It's not too much, it's not too little, it looks cool. Yeah, so this is cool. Okay, so we'll go with this, and let's set up our camera. So you can see this only took 37 seconds, which is blazing fast. It's not a huge sized render, but for how many particles, motion blur, all that neat stuff that's going on, I mean, it's pretty good. So let's rotate the camera around, get a nice little angle. I think right now there's 1.5 million particles emitted, a little shy of 1.6 million. So it's a good amount of particles. So the viewport's a little slow, but let's move around, get a cool dynamic angle. Let's see, something like this. This looks pretty neat. Let's zoom in a little bit, move that down, and let's check out an IPR of this. Let's just see what this looks like before I actually go with the finished render. And I'll crank up the settings a bit. And once we go for the final render, I'll end up pausing the video in case it takes a little longer than expected. And here we have our sim. The pink is a little too strong for my taste, so I'm actually gonna edit the ramp on that real quick. So let's hit the particles, RGB PP, edit ramp, And let's push the purple in a little more to the right. And let's actually maybe tone down the pink a little. Just a little bit. It's a little darker. A little too vibrant. I think the physical light I have next to it is also kind of giving it that extra pop. So let's pause this. Let's see if it will update. And where's the physical light? Let's actually see what it looks like with it off or a little toned down. So let this load up again. And due to the motion blur, it takes a little longer to do the translation step because it gets information from the next frame and the past frame, the previous frame, in order to calculate the motion blur. So if I turn that off, it actually IPR fires up a lot faster. But okay, so now we got actually a lot more purple. So maybe that's too much purple now. Let's move that back just a tad. And go back into our particle. Right click, edit ramp. Let's move that just a bit to the left. And make this a little bit brighter. It's at 75, so let's, I don't know. Let's try 0.9. So it's not it's not 100, it's not super bright, but it's quite a bit brighter. And let's move the camera a bit to refresh. Let's see. Okay, yeah, this looks cool. It's got a little bit of blue, a little bit of purple, a little bit of that hot pink. Yeah, let's just find a cool angle now. Let's try something like this. This looks pretty neat, I think. Want a little more of that blue showing though. Let's move it a little this way. Up a bit. Maybe I'll slide the blue gradient a little bit further. Yeah, let's just slide that a little bit further up. Just to get a little more blue going on. Right there. And let's go back to that last angle we had. It's kind of good. Something like this. And let's see how this looks. So to recap, basically you just have to make sure when you first select your particle sim, make sure to add a Redshift Visibility node. So you go up here, Object Properties, add Visibility, and this is just something you should do out of habit, just because if you put some glass or something and it's refracting through, you're gonna be like, whoa, what's going on? There's nothing behind it. And so just that's why. This adds basically visibility information, so it'll be refracting, it'll self-shadow, etc., etc. And so this is just something you should add out of habit every time you make an nParticle sim and you want to render in Redshift. And after that, you just make sure you assign a redshift material, and in this case, you know, you would use the standard redshift Uber material. And after that, you could either use the particle sampler node and pipe out color, and out transparency. Make sure you reverse, or which is the newer way, and I prefer using Redshift user data color nodes, and then you just type in RGB PP. You make the output go into diffuse. Same thing with the second one, transparency PP. Reverse it, and then pipe that into your opacity, and you should be good to go. And if you're getting any weird transparency stuff going on, make sure, you know, if you need more fidelity, increase the trace depths a bit. And also, if you want motion blur, you just enable it, and it's good to go. So here's what we got right now. Pretty cool. Let's try to brighten up the physical light a little bit so we can get a little stronger highlight, since the physical light is right around here. So let's crank that up to I don't know, let's double it. So let's do 30. Let's see how that looks. And it'll probably give it a nice rim light going on over here. Let's wait for that to load a little. Yeah, it's a little stronger. Let's go even stronger. Let's just do something, I don't know, 100. Just see what happens. Yeah, it's a little too strong. But it just go back to, I don't know, 20. And let's actually increase the motion blur just a little bit. So frame duration, let's go with 2 just to see how that looks. Yeah, the motion blur is quite a bit stronger now. And so we're going to go with the final render of this. Let's just fire this off and see how it turns out. And I'll be pausing it, and I'll be doing 2 versions so we can flip through them. I'll do one with the max trace depth and then the stock defaults, just so you could see the subtle differences that you get when you increase this. And it increases render time, but it also increases quality when using opacity or refractive objects. And so since we're using opacity, we're gonna give that a shot so you can notice the difference. It's subtle, but it's there. And even with motion blur, you'll still kind of notice it. So I'll be pausing and getting right back to it. So the render's about to finish. I did 2 different versions. I cranked up actually the GI samples and increased the samples on pretty much everything I could. And the only difference between the 2 renders I did was the trace depth, so you guys can see the difference that it really makes. And so this one right here was using default 3 reflection, 3 refraction, 6 combined, which is the defaults, and the render time was 430 for a 1000 by 1200 render. And so if you zoom in, you know, it's not bad for a brute force irradiance point cloud. And so you can see the motion blur is nice and clean, and you have lots of little particles and stuff going on. And some of it looks kind of washed out down here. And so this is what I'm talking about with the trace depths. Basically, after the 3 refractions and whatnot, and the 3 reflections, since there's a little bit of specular on the spheres themselves, Redshift no longer, the rays no longer basically fire back, and so it cuts off. And what ends up happening is you lose out on the fidelity in some of the refracted objects and the specular in heavily transparent areas where there's a lot of layering going on. And so right here there's a ton of layering. There's the massive particles that are way back here, the blue ones, and then it wraps around and it wraps around and goes up. And so there's a lot of layered particles here in this area. And so if we compare this with the second version that it's mid-render right now, and I increased everything to the max 16, and you compare the two, just so we can just swap between the two, you see this going on right here. It's losing all this nice rich fidelity that you get. You actually can see the layering of the blue particles in the distance, the thicker particle strands that are a little closer and thicker, larger clumping, more specular on them. And so if you flip through them, you see that adds a big difference in depth in these regions where there's a lot of layering. And so, I mean, if you don't mind the those little subtleties in like an animation, then, you know, who cares really, right? But it makes a big difference for stills for sure, but it also adds a huge amount of render time to crank this up to the max. But if render time's not really an issue, which it shouldn't be, it's a GPU render, so you could render out an animation overnight, then, you know, you're good to go. This would take forever in a traditional CPU rendering engine to do for a clean image like this at this scale. And so the difference though is pretty large, you can tell, and that's just due to the fact that trace depths are kicking in, and so you're getting stronger spec, you're getting stronger refraction and layering of objects because the rays have more depth to them basically. And so this just for a comparison of render times, this is 4 minutes and 30. All the settings are the same, GI, minimum, max samples, etc., etc. The only thing that changed is the trace depths. And so it went from 4 minutes and 30 seconds to 23 minutes, which is huge. That's a massive jump. And that's basically because the rays are bouncing around, doing a lot more stuff rather than being cut off quickly with lower settings. And so it doesn't make much of a difference in areas that aren't layered up. So particles that are basically, you know, 1 or 2 layers deep. But once you start getting in through the cloud of, you know, hundreds of particles and whatnot that's going on right here, where it's thick, it makes actually a big difference, and you get a nice sense of the form by increasing the settings. So again, right now Redshift is only limited to 16. Eventually the devs mentioned that they're going to increase this cap, so, you know, and also they'll be separating it so you can do it on a per object basis. Right now, if you crank this up, it's doing it for everything in the scene. And so if you had a scene with like some particles and some glass and stuff, increasing this is going to do it to everything. And that's kind of a waste of resources basically, and it'll slow down your entire scene. So I believe in version 2.5, which should be coming out pretty soon, they'll be allowing you to target your trace steps on a per object basis, and so that way in your scene you can only add it to glass objects and particles and stuff like this that would have opacity, where you don't need it on everything, since this is scene wide right now. And so yeah, this covers basically everything you need to know to render Maya nParticles in Redshift.